The story begins with one of the most outrageous situations a homeowner could ever imagine, and it all started with a letter delivered right to their front door. It wasn't a simple notice about lawn care, paint colors, or a reminder about community dues. No, this letter was something far more unbelievable. It was a lawsuit. A lawsuit demanding $3.2 million in damages. The accusation? That this single homeowner was somehow responsible for a massive neighborhood flood that destroyed yards, damaged community property, and cost the HOA a fortune in repairs. At first glance, you'd think this had to be some kind of mix-up. Maybe the paperwork was meant for someone else. Maybe it was just a clerical error. But as the homeowner read through the pages, the horrifying truth set in. The HOA was dead serious. Now here's where things get absolutely absurd. The flooding didn't even come from their property. It came from a river, a natural waterway that had existed long before the community was even built. A river that cut through county land, a river no homeowner could possibly own or control. Yet somehow, in the tangled world of HOA politics and power plays, this homeowner was being accused of negligence, blamed for not preventing Mother Nature from doing what she does best. Imagine the shock, the disbelief. The sinking feeling of realizing you're being dragged into a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for something you couldn't possibly have stopped. The letter painted a picture as if this homeowner had single-handedly redirected the river, caused the banks to overflow, and stood by laughing as water spilled into streets and yards. The accusations were written with the confidence of people who thought they could bully their way into making anyone believe them. But behind those words was an agenda. Someone on the HOA board, the kind of person who thrives on control and intimidation, had decided that this was the perfect scapegoat. And the target? An ordinary homeowner who simply lived near the water but had no authority over it. Think about the weight of seeing $200,000 written in black and white. For most people, that's not just a lot of money, it's an impossible number, a figure so high it doesn't even feel real. That's the kind of amount that ruins lives, wipes out savings, and leaves scars forever. And yet, here it was, hanging over someone's head for no reason other than the HOA's desperate attempt to blame someone, anyone, for a disaster caused by nature. From the moment that letter arrived, nothing felt safe anymore. The home, the place meant to be a sanctuary, suddenly became the center of a legal nightmare. The homeowner found themselves pacing at night, wondering how this could even happen. How could people they saw at block parties, people who waved while walking their dogs, suddenly turn around and accuse them of something so ridiculous? It was more than a lawsuit. It was betrayal. And at the core of it all was that bitter irony. The river didn't belong to them. They didn't build it, didn't manage it, couldn't control it. Yet somehow this homeowner was being painted as the villain in a story where the real antagonist was a natural flood no one could stop. It's the kind of situation that makes you question everything about HOAs, the power they wield, the lengths they'll go to assert control, and the sheer madness of watching neighbors weaponize the system against one another. This first strike, this lawsuit, set the tone for everything that followed. It showed just how reckless and extreme an HOA can become when driven by arrogance, fear, and a desire to find someone to blame. And for the homeowner, it was only the beginning of a long, exhausting battle that would test not just their finances, but their spirit, their resilience, and their faith in the idea of community. When the homeowner first tried to understand how the HOA could even attempt such a lawsuit, the board's reasoning came tumbling out in a mix of arrogance and twisted logic. According to them, the flooding wasn't just the fault of the river. No, they claimed it was because the homeowner hadn't properly maintained their property. They argued that the way the land was landscaped somehow redirected water toward the community. They insisted that drainage pipes, which didn't even belong to the homeowner, should have been better cared for. And in the wildest stretch of imagination, they suggested that by living so close to the river, this person had an obligation to prevent it from overflowing. The sheer audacity of that claim was enough to make anyone's jaw drop. It became clear that this wasn't about facts. This was about finding someone to blame and, more importantly, finding someone to pay. The HOA had spent a fortune repairing common areas, repaving roads, and handling water damage to their beloved clubhouse, And instead of shouldering the costs as an organization, they pointed the finger at a single resident. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, you know there's always that one person, the self-appointed queen bee, the Karen of the board, who pushes the narrative the hardest. She was the one standing up in meetings, wagging her finger, saying the homeowner should have taken responsibility. She was the one who convinced others that this lawsuit made sense. And soon enough, her voice became the loudest in the room. The HOA began piling up their so-called evidence. They took photos of puddles in the backyard and claimed it proved poor drainage. They snapped pictures of weeds near the fence line and suggested that neglect had contributed to soil erosion. They even tried to twist county inspection reports into something that looked like blame. It didn't matter that the river was owned and managed by the county. It didn't matter that heavy rainfall had been the true cause of the flooding. None of those truths fit their narrative. What mattered was making it look like the homeowner had failed the community, and that failure had cost everyone dearly. At meetings, neighbors sat in stunned silence as board members presented their version of events. Some were too afraid to speak up, worried about drawing the board's wrath onto themselves. Others just nodded along, not wanting to get caught in the middle. That's how HOA power works, through intimidation and a carefully crafted illusion of authority. If you question it, you risk becoming the next target. So, many residents simply let the Karen on the board continue her tirade, shaking their heads in private but staying silent in public. The more the board pushed, the more ridiculous their claims became. They argued that the homeowner should have installed a private retaining wall. They suggested that sandbags should have been placed before the storm, as if one person could hold back the force of an entire river. They even accused the homeowner of ignoring warnings, as though there was a crystal ball predicting the flood, and only one household was responsible for taking action. To the homeowner, it felt like they were living in an alternate reality, one where logic didn't matter, and the HOA could simply rewrite the rules to suit their agenda. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power. It was about a board trying to flex its control, led by a Karen who thrived on fear and finger-pointing. And once they decided on a scapegoat, they clung to their version of events like it was gospel. The absurd arguments, the baseless accusations, and the twisted reasoning all pointed to one thing. The HOA didn't care about truth. They cared about winning, and as the homeowner listened to the lies pile up, they realized something terrifying. This wasn't going to be an easy fight. The board had already spun their story, and in the eyes of many neighbors, perception was everything. The lawsuit was no longer just paperwork. It was the embodiment of the board's arrogance, and fighting back meant standing against a machine designed to silence and crush anyone who dared to resist. The moment the accusations were made public, the homeowner knew they couldn't just sit back and let the HOA drag their name through the mud. They needed a defense, not just for the lawsuit, but for their own sanity. The first step was simple: gather the facts. They pulled property records, county maps, and government documents showing exactly who owned the river and the land around it. Every line of text proved the same thing. The river was public land, managed by the county, and completely outside the homeowner's control. No landscaping, no drainage system, no personal project could have changed the course of that flood. Yet here they were, being accused as though they'd built the river themselves. The homeowner began reaching out to local authorities. County officials, environmental experts, and even engineers all confirmed the same thing. The flooding was a natural event caused by heavy rainfall and a swollen river. It wasn't something one person could have prevented. Still, the HOA clung to their narrative. They dismissed reports and ignored evidence, acting like professionals didn't know what they were talking about. That stubbornness revealed the truth. The HOA didn't care about reality. They cared about sticking the blame on someone so they wouldn't have to accept responsibility for their own failures. Despite the frustration, the homeowner refused to be bullied. They hired an attorney, someone who had seen cases like this before, instances where HOAs overstepped, using intimidation as a weapon. The attorney carefully pieced together a defense, building it brick by brick with undeniable facts. Satellite images showed the river's overflowing banks. Photographs from neighbors revealed the widespread nature of the flood, and county reports proved the cause was entirely natural. The more evidence they stacked, the clearer the picture became. The homeowner was innocent, and the HOA's claims were built on nothing but bluster. But even with truth on their side, the homeowner felt the pressure of the fight. Court battles aren't just about facts. They're about stamina, time, and the emotional toll of being under constant attack. Every time they pulled into their driveway, they felt eyes watching. Every trip to the grocery store came with whispers from neighbors who had heard only the HOA's side of the story. It was exhausting living under that cloud of suspicion. Yet in those moments of doubt, the homeowner reminded themselves why they were fighting. Because if they gave in, the HOA would win not just this battle, but the right to bully anyone they chose. The defense wasn't just about legal documents. It was about reclaiming dignity. The homeowner began speaking out at meetings, calmly pointing out the facts and exposing the holes in the HOA's story. They showed the maps, the ownership records, the county reports. They reminded everyone that the river wasn't theirs to control, and no homeowner should ever be held responsible for the forces of nature. Some neighbors began to nod, slowly realizing the truth. Others stayed quiet, still too afraid of the board's wrath. But cracks were beginning to form in the HOA's armor. The homeowner also leaned on community support outside the HOA's bubble. Friends, local reporters, even environmental groups began to take notice. The absurdity of the lawsuit became a story in itself, and suddenly the HOA wasn't just fighting one homeowner, they were fighting public opinion. That was when the board started to squirm. Their airtight narrative wasn't holding up under scrutiny, and the Karen at the center of it all found herself questioned in ways she never expected. For the homeowner, every step of the defense was both a battle and a reminder of their strength. They weren't just some powerless resident being steamrolled by a committee. They were someone willing to stand up, armed with truth and determination, against an organization that had overreached. The defense wasn't just about winning in court. It was about proving that common sense still mattered, that you couldn't blame a single person for the will of nature, and that even the loudest HOA bully could be silenced by facts. As the case dragged on, the neighborhood itself became a stage for the drama. What had once been a quiet community filled with casual greetings and friendly small talk was now a place charged with whispers, glances, and uneasy silences. The HOA's lawsuit didn't just pit the board against one homeowner, it began to divide the entire neighborhood. Some residents quietly supported the homeowner, shaking their heads at the ridiculousness of the accusations, but they were too afraid to say anything publicly. Others, swayed by the board's fiery speeches and the constant fear-mongering of its self-appointed Karen leader, started treating the homeowner like a pariah. Every board meeting turned into a spectacle. Karen would stand tall at the front, her binder clutched like a weapon, dramatically retelling the story of the flood as though the homeowner had orchestrated the entire disaster. She'd raise her voice, gesture wildly, and paint vivid pictures of damage done to common areas. Every word was laced with one clear message. This homeowner is the villain who cost you money. And with that performance, she stirred up tension and anger, turning ordinary neighbors into a crowd ready to believe the worst. Behind closed doors, however, many residents were growing tired of the circus. They didn't buy the idea that one person could cause an entire river to flood. They didn't understand why their HOA dues were being spent on a lawsuit that made no sense. But fear held them back. In HOA-run neighborhoods, stepping out of line could mean fines, harassment, or even becoming the next target of the board's scrutiny. So, while a few brave voices whispered support to the homeowner, most people stayed silent, hoping to stay invisible. The gossip was relentless. Walking down the street, the homeowner could hear their name whispered in hushed conversations. Children repeated bits of overheard arguments, carrying stories home to their parents. Some neighbors stopped waving when passing by, as though acknowledging the homeowner might somehow pull them into the mess. Others, the true gossips, seemed to relish in repeating Karen's talking points, twisting them into even bigger tales. The flood had damaged lawns and fences, yes? But the real flood was the wave of drama that now washed over every interaction in the community. The homeowner, Once a regular face at block parties and community barbecues, now found themselves isolated. Invitations disappeared. Conversations ended abruptly when they walked into a room, and what used to be friendly faces now looked the other way. That isolation stung almost as much as the lawsuit itself. It wasn't just about fighting the HOA anymore. It was about watching friendships evaporate under the pressure of false accusations. And then there were the moments of quiet defiance. A neighbor slipping a note into the mailbox that read, "Hang in there. We know the truth." Another quietly passing along a recording of a board meeting where Karen contradicted herself. These small acts of rebellion kept the homeowner going, reminders that not everyone had bought into the lies. It proved that even in a climate of fear, there were people who still valued honesty over the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. But Karen wasn't letting go. She thrived on the attention, the drama, the control. For her, the lawsuit wasn't just about money, it was about power. She wanted to send a message, to show that anyone who dared to challenge the HOA would be crushed, humiliated, and financially ruined. That determination made every meeting more intense, every community interaction more strained. The neighborhood was no longer a community. It was a battleground. Every backyard fence and sidewalk conversation was touched by the lawsuit. And in the middle of it all, the homeowner stood strong, refusing to bow to the pressure. Because they knew one thing Karen and her allies didn't expect. Lies could only stretch so far before the truth finally snapped them in two. The day finally came when all the arguments, accusations, and endless community drama had to be put to the ultimate test, the courtroom. After months of stress, sleepless nights, and whispered gossip echoing through the neighborhood, the homeowner walked into that room carrying the weight of $3.2 million on their shoulders. It wasn't just money, it was their reputation, their home, and their future. Across the aisle sat the HOA board, led proudly by Karen herself, clutching her stacks of binders like trophies. She wore the look of someone convinced she was about to win, already imagining the smug satisfaction of watching the judge rule in her favor. But courtrooms don't run on drama or intimidation. They run on evidence. And this was where the cracks in the HOA's story finally began to show. The HOA's lawyer tried to paint the picture they'd been pushing for months, that this single homeowner had neglected their property, failed the community, and somehow allowed a natural river to flood the neighborhood. They paraded photos of puddles, cherry-picked documents, and exaggerated damages. Karen herself even took the stand, delivering her usual theatrics, voice trembling with exaggerated outrage as she accused the homeowner of ignoring their so-called responsibilities. But for the first time, her performance didn't have the same effect. There was no audience of neighbors to nod along, no boardroom silence to fill with her voice. There was only the steady gaze of the judge who listened patiently, then pressed for facts, not feelings. And that's where the HOA stumbled. When it was the homeowner's turn, their attorney laid out the defense with calm precision. County records proved the river was public land, maintained by local government, and had nothing to do with private property owners. Environmental experts testified that the flooding was a direct result of heavy rainfall, not negligence. Engineers explained how no amount of landscaping, retaining walls, or sandbags from one household could have stopped the force of an entire river spilling over its banks. Piece by piece, the HOA's case unraveled, leaving nothing but speculation and finger-pointing. The turning point came when the judge asked the simplest of questions. Do you have any legal evidence that this homeowner owns or controls the river? The HOA's lawyer hesitated, shuffled papers, and glanced nervously at Karen. The silence that followed was louder than any speech Karen had ever delivered. Because the truth was undeniable, they had no proof. They never did. All they had was blame, and in a court of law, blame without evidence is worthless. As the ruling was read, the tension broke. The lawsuit was dismissed. The homeowner was cleared of all responsibility. Not only did they not owe a single cent, but the HOA had wasted thousands of dollars of residents' dues chasing a case that never should have existed in the first place. Karen's face, once so confident and fiery, drained of color as reality sank in. The courtroom didn't reward her theatrics. It didn't applaud her power trip. It exposed her for what she was, a bully hiding behind a board. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some residents were furious, not at the homeowner, but at the HOA for dragging everyone into such an embarrassing and costly mess. Others felt relief that the ordeal was finally over. And for the first time in months, people began to see the homeowner not as a villain, but as someone who had stood their ground against impossible odds. Slowly, the whispers shifted. Stories changed, and Karen, once so loud, suddenly found her voice wasn't carrying the same weight anymore. The lawsuit that was supposed to destroy one person ended up destroying the HOA's credibility instead. The homeowner walked away vindicated, not just in court, but in the eyes of anyone willing to look at the truth. And though the scars of that battle remained, the stress, the lost friendships, the months of isolation, there was also pride. Pride in knowing they hadn't been crushed. Pride in showing that even when an HOA tries to wield its power like a weapon, the truth can still cut sharper.